Hello, welcome to TELLAL Talks Live. Today's webinar is us discussing and sharing the story of a student teacher, a TELLAL student teacher, and her experiences while she engaged in the ATP qualifying program as we moved from face-to-face teaching into a more remote mode of learning and teaching. And the aim is for us to share experiences and then to think creatively and innovatively about our approach to teacher training and how this experience will impact on our student teacher as she moves into her full-time teaching career as a novice teacher. So, without further ado, let me hand over to the star of our show today, Asma, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sure. So I am finishing just now. Actually, today was my last day of teacher training with TELLAL. It's been a wonderful year, and I feel really privileged and blessed that we did get to experience this remote learning phase, because it was such a unique opportunity for students and teachers to really bring our education into the 21st century. I think that a lot of us in education have not made that jump forward, and I know myself personally, I've always been a very resource heavy person. I like handing out papers, I like having physical resources, and this taught me so much about how to really transform my education. So
thank you, Asma. We'll come back and talk in more detail about some of the points that you just made. The other person in our webinar this afternoon is Mick Gernon. Mick, hello Mick, and welcome.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Mick Gernon. I'm Chief Education Innovation Officer with GEMS. My job during this time has actually been to help and support all of our schools in putting their remote learning plans together, to keep it up to pace to how those are going, what the quality of those interactions have been, and now are planning in terms of return for September. So yeah, a really interesting time, I think a challenging time for all of us.
Thank you. So Asma, if we talk about a little bit more about you, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to join the teaching profession, what attracted you, and why in particular this program that you are currently enrolled in?
Sure. So I originally did study education in university, but due to a lot of personal reasons, I had small children at the time, I didn't do my qualifying year. I finished my degree without having done physical training. So I had a lot of the theoretical background and knowledge, and as my children got older, I knew I wanted to get in the classroom. And although I was fully qualified, I had my teaching license and degree, I knew that I didn't feel like I would be able to do my students justice. Even if I did get a job, I wouldn't feel that I had the amount of real training and mentorship that I would need. And so when I got back into working in a school, just as a learning support staff, I waited several years, and because I was in gyms, I saw a number of my coworkers go through TELLAL. And I saw how much practical and real hands-on experience they were getting and the quality of the mentorship they were getting. So I knew that I wanted to do it as soon as I had the opportunity. So I was actually just waiting year by year. We moved here in Dubai 2015, which was when I think TELLAL had just started. And I just waited year by year to see when I felt my kids were old enough to be independent to handle themselves for a year. And then I jumped for it this year. And it was the perfect timing.
Yeah, well, I can say that I'm glad that you did. So since joining the program then, if you could just think about and reflect, Asma, on some particularly kind of light bulb moments that you've experienced since joining the program, can you describe any of those to us?
Absolutely. So I would say at the very beginning, I had a lot of concern about which year group I'd be put in. And I spoke to one of my friends who had done TELLAL, and I told her, what if they put me in FS? Like with little tiny children, I can't handle that. She told me it doesn't matter. The same teaching skills you're going to get for FS or what you'd be using as a college professor, it's the same concepts, the high leverage teaching practices. It's something universal that goes for all teaching phases. And so that really calmed me down because I think that you tend to want to, some of us are really perfectionists. We know, like, we have an idea of what we want. But over time, as we've gone through the program, I saw how little a teacher needs to know of the subject-specific details compared to the concept of the pedagogy and how to structure learning. So I think that was a big light bulb moment for me, that if you've learned how to teach primary well, you'd be able to figure out how to teach high school biology well. It's the way you scaffold, it's the way you differentiate, it's the way you structure learning for students, how you manage a class. Behavior is an issue for FS students as much as it is for university students. So it's really just different ways of the same practice.
Yeah. And so with that kind of, with your professional knowledge, you develop in your practice, there was a sudden shift from what you were getting very familiar with, your face-to-face classroom teaching, and I was there to observe you a number of times, and it was an absolute pleasure. But I could also see in your practice and the way that you are as a person that you liked being present and in the room with your students. So tell us about that shift. What kind of journey did you experience as we went from face-to-face, literally, to remote learning literally overnight? What was your journey like, Asma?
So it was even more of a gigantic shift for me than even the average trainee, because I wasn't just shifting with a class I knew. It just so happened that I was beginning to transition to take over the class of a teacher who was leaving. So I had literally met the students I began to teach 1 or 2 days before remote learning began. And since it was so uncertain what would happen, we had expected that he would be with me for a month doing a transition process where he would be overseeing me, and I would just get to know the students. But it just happened that because spring break was pushed forward and then remote learning began, he had to leave. And so I was with a class of brand new students from the start of remote learning. I never ever taught them in person. And so I would say what has amazed me is how close I've been able to get to them. I really, I felt so close to these students. And just because of a variety of options I used, I believe, like for making my lessons more interactive so I could really see their work, really communicate with them, I felt that you can do that, that you really can have a very personal relationship with students, even if you're remote.
Yeah. And how were you teaching? Can you just kind of describe what kind of platform, etc., you were using for your classroom interactions?
Sure. Well, I was very fortunate that because I was in GEMS Winchester, and the school from the start was committed to doing fully live lessons. Our timetable did not change. We were just from the start online using Microsoft Teams. Everything about the schedule remained exactly the same. So because of that, we had a constant sense of presence and communication with the students. But what I did in addition, our lesson planning was mainly through PowerPoint. And I personally, I felt from the start I wouldn't be able to just use the chat feature to get responses from students or hand raising. So what I found were these very amazing programs called Nearpod and Pear Deck, which basically turn your slides into an interactive slide that every single student interacts with, and you see what they're doing at the moment. And especially when you're teaching English and reading and writing, and you want to see how a student is interacting with the text or see what they're writing as they're writing it, I just felt I was so in tune with my students in a way that I couldn't have been in the classroom. And which is, I'm a very active, I've put on so much weight during lockdown because I'm a very active teacher that my body is used to like constant movement. And so I'm like usually like buzzing student to student to see how they're doing. But in this case, it's like in front of my screen. I'm seeing 30 students writing at once and able to feed back immediately. I mean, to me, that was just transformative. And I can imagine I'm not going to get back to my super active teaching self if I have them all in front of me already. You might just want to go to a little focus group, but you can just sit and know what's happening. Everyone's writing, and tell someone like, where's your full stops? I mean, there aren't any. So like go, you just immediately, tell them what they need to do, and they get to it. And they're so happy to hear that immediate feedback.
Yeah.
Can I just offer a sort of reflection into that? Because I think your journey, Asma, is similar to everyone else, that everyone else was thrown into this. It was a giant step. But as you say, the relationships piece, I think, has been the real strength out of everything that's come out of remote learning. And how you've just described your relationship with your students and getting to know them, not just as people, but actually getting underneath the skin of their work and what that means, and your, I suppose, ability and agility to actually then intervene at that point of greatest need and make an immediate difference. That means that students are going to make greater progress throughout those sessions. And that's certainly something we've seen across all of our schools, Jyoti, in terms of what this remote learning provision has actually been. And great that you were using Teams and all of the other pieces there, because I think the one thing that people think about when you say remote learning, they all of a sudden think I'm learning on my own, and I'm not. I'm still collaborating, and I'm probably collaborating more within this online space than maybe I would have been if I was actually in a physical classroom space.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah. So, what you've done for us is you've described, the kind of experiences of transition, if you like. What would you say have been your challenges from going from face-to-face to remote, if any, and what did you do to overcome those, Asma?
So I definitely would say it is harder to scan the room. You might be having a good amount of engagement, half to 2/3 of the class, and you feel like it's buzzing. But then it is easy to forget. Like in a classroom, you can see the couple of kids who are just not engaged. But because it is sort of like audio silence in the online class from them, you can't tell. Maybe they're having a genuine tech problem, and that happens to me sometimes. I have a genuine tech problem. But so what I learned a bit too late, and I felt this is something I would take going forward, is that you immediately figure out who's not participating and get in touch with the family. And I really realized that it's something that you have to be a lot more on top of, because if the students aren't in the class, you've got to just get on it. And I had a situation where one student didn't want to come to live classes. I think he was a bit camera shy. Even though we didn't do camera, he just felt awkward about it. I had a meeting with his mom, and she told me, oh, but he said there weren't any live classes. I told her, no, I'm quite sure I've notified him and talked to him about them many times. He became one of my best students after that meeting. He was there every day, fully present, and I think because he saw how interactive the lessons were, he hadn't seen the point. He thought it was going to be this very remote, like just sitting and doing our work silently. But when he saw how interactive it could be, he really just blew my mind with what he was able to accomplish, and the rest of the, for the rest of the term. I really feel that you have to be more in touch with the families in remote learning, even more. They are huge allies. They want their children, they're worried about their children being engaged. So, and some of them, they ended up, you get closer and they appreciate what you do because they're able to see it. And even in secondary where you don't have as much contact with them, I'd have parents who would, be making comments like, I don't think I really like this poem. And then the boy would tell me, and I would say, it's okay. It's your, everyone has their own opinion about poetry.
Yeah.
Like, so like the families were a lot more engaged in the online learning overall. So they have to be your allies.
And so what do you think, Mick, having heard those challenges, are they kind of closely aligned to the bigger picture?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, as I say, it's about going back to that understanding of the learning process. And Asma, you spoke very eloquently about this earlier on, around you've done a lot of the theory, but actually because of the TELLAL program, getting more hands-on and practical experience as a result of that. But I think the underlying thing here is that teaching online in the way that we have been doing requires a very different pedagogy than what you would normally deploy within a classroom. And you've just said there around scanning the room, etc., etc. You've got to think, and you've got to think about breaking your tasks down in different ways. You've got to think about when do you intervene, when do you stop your groups, how much support you actually give each of those groups. It really is a very different ball game than what it was in the classroom. And I think over the first few weeks, again, the same way that you've described it, many of our teachers, I suppose, found their way. It's fair to say, when we were popping into lessons to look at observations, we could see, and we were given feedback about how to improve, what to do there. And there were some brilliant examples across the entire network, but they were the ones who'd actually genuinely changed and thought about their pedagogy. Maybe they were a little bit more experienced in terms of using some of the technology pieces that we have in place in GEMS, and therefore others were then beginning to learn from that. So yeah, it very much mirrors what's happened across all of our schools.
Yeah. Okay. So that's good to know, Asma, because like we said earlier, when we teach remotely, we often feel that we're alone at teaching as well, where if you're used to that school environment, you're so, it's a more social environment, isn't it? And it's good to know that others were experiencing, similar kind of challenges and being able to overcome them. So moving on now, thinking about your engagement in both face-to-face and remote learning, and now you've almost successfully completed this program and will very soon be qualified. What would your advice be to anyone who is interested in joining the profession, and maybe those who are currently engaged in a teacher training qualification route? What would your advice be to them in terms of their current and future practice?
I think just really having a very flexible and growth mindset is so key. And I think that that's the critical factor, that you have to be a very humble person and acknowledge your weaknesses. And it's not a personal insult. Know that everyone is working on their weaknesses. I have so many specific areas that I feel like I'm just barely chipping away at day by day or week by week. And I think they'll be my targets for years to come. And it doesn't mean that you're a failure, because everyone has some strengths and everyone has some weaknesses. So I think that it's that mindset that you want feedback. You don't feel offended by it. You ask, you're hoping that somebody tells you something that you can improve in your practice. I would say also being very aware that observing other teachers and looking for good practice in your school, no matter what school you're in. And I think having read that from both John Hattie's research and Teach Like a Champion, the concept that every school has more variability between the best teachers and the lower performing teachers than good schools versus bad schools. The actual in-school variability means you will find good practice in every school, in any school, and you've got to. And I would say, like, seeking that out. You have to seek that out and see what are they doing, because there are teachers who are amazingly successful right down the hall. And you can see what are they doing, what relationships are they building, how were they scaffolding this topic, how were they ensuring all students are getting it. I would say just that consistent getting out of your own classroom, because I think a lot of teachers, and I remember my wonderful mentor in RDS was encouraging me constantly, get out and see other people, not just me. Although she was a brilliant teacher, she knew that my style will end up being different than hers. I have to see other people, other examples. And I had a lot of opportunities to do that. And I just had a little notebook and I magpied so many ideas of how do I call for attention. When a student interrupts in this way, how do you either brush it off or address it? All those little details that really professional teachers have picked up. And then I guess, just that the flexibility and the willingness to improve. And I would recommend, I think my final recommendation is get on Twitter, because there has been some amazing professional development on Twitter that's just free or very low cost. And even with all that TELLAL has given me for subject-specific learning, if you're on Twitter, you'll be like with people who are just on top of their fields, doing research. It's like a harmony between researchers and practitioners. And it's something that I've benefited so much from building my subject knowledge.
So that's in terms of your kind of general approach to teaching and what we would call your philosophy of teaching, if you like. How about your engagement with remote learning and teaching? How will that impact on your practice should schools open and the doors are wide open again and students start walking back in? How do you think it's going to impact on your day-to-day future practice?
I definitely think, funnily, literally the week before we even thought of remote learning happening, my mentor at Winchester told me, she was challenging me. She said, Asma, I love how, I know you have an SEND background, you love your physical resources, but I just want you to try to do one lesson totally digital. She was telling it to me like as if she knew like I was never going to be able to do this. This is like the challenge of my life. And so I really felt that was like poetic justice, because in the end I had to do an entire term with no paper. And so I just feel that for ecological reasons and for the fact that our students are so digital, they should be typing rather than writing a lot of the time, especially in the secondary. There should be a lot more typing happening. I have a student who is a beautiful writer and has never been marked well. And I know it's because of his handwriting. He has doctor handwriting. But when I saw his typed work and the brilliance that you can see through it because you're not struggling to read it, it just made me feel like if he goes back to school and doesn't have that, it would be a tragedy because his teachers won't appreciate it. So I think really that moving to more fully digital work, not having to lug books around that I need to mark because it's all online. I can easily compare past and previous work any time of day. I think that this comfort that we've developed now, that we're now digital teaching natives, is something that you can't go back from because you've seen the potential of it and you've seen the ease of it and you've seen how much students engage and they're very confident more than me. They tell me what to do half of the time. They're my tech support. So
that's so refreshing to hear that. And I know there's lots of studies about people who are coming into the profession are a lot more optimistic around the power of digital and the power of technology to actually make things better. Not to replace, but as you say, to use in very, very different ways. And just going back to something you said earlier on, you talked about, almost like having a growth mindset. There's nothing in teaching that's fixed. And it's great for you to reflect on that, to say, I don't come in with one set of views or one way of teaching, or my teaching is better than your teaching, or I must just copy this person. But actually, it's about being able to learn from each other. And rather like you, I spend too much time on Twitter these days, but there is a lot of good stuff that's out there that is very, very helpful and supportive. But I think your journey is very similar to what's happening in general within the education system. So I think we were thrown into this, and there was that stage of panic and everything was unsettled and we're not too sure what's going to work and what's not going to work. Then we get into this current period now where we've been through remote learning and actually people are really comfortable with it. And it's serving the purpose for now. What we now need to do is reflect on this, but then go into that growth stage as an education system as well and as individual educators. Because I don't think that anyone, and despite what anyone says about the traditions of school, I don't think anyone would go back to our first scenario pre-COVID. I don't think anyone wants to continue with the current scenario during COVID, but I think what everyone wants to look at is a move towards either blended or hybrid approaches to learning, which build on the very best of things that we've learned during this period, and then takes learning forward in a very, very different way. And I think then, people coming into the profession are probably more aligned with that type of thinking around being flexible. But one of the big mantras that people have currently is that the future is very uncertain, and so people learn. But what we want you to do is learn something, unlearn it, and learn something new. And that sort of cycle of learn, unlearn, learn, we think is more about the future and the sort of skill sets we want to see within our students. But then as teachers, we also need to be able to model that. So I think our scenario when we come back in September, which will be a partial return, we know that, I think it'll take the very best, but I think it will take it much further than anything that we've actually had before. And really then it's down to us as to how far we want to push that and how quickly we want to push it as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure you will both agree that these are very exciting times. So, bit of a shock, bit of fear, anxiety, and probably a lot of stress amongst the teaching and educating population. But, thinking forward, moving forward, I personally, and I know you do, Asma, as well, because you raised this with me previously and said that you actually feel that even though the situation wasn't very pleasant, but the opportunity that arose as a result of the going remote, you saw that as a positive, right?
Absolutely. And it was so encouraged by, I think that we were very lucky in TELLAL that you told us from the start that we are expected to participate in this process. A lot of PGCEs didn't, and they told their students it's over. And I think that would have been a huge loss. And I have friends who work in programs like that, and they feel that they've totally missed this opportunity, and that if they go back to schools, they would have, they're starting from behind. So we were very fortunate, like both with TELLAL itself and with my school, that from the start, they just told us to look at this as a learning opportunity, take advantage,
and
encourage innovation.
On all stakeholders, doesn't it? So it's just switching to you from being a student teacher in the classroom put yourself in, as you are the student, which you have been, you've been our student, and we had to also make a shift when this situation occurred. And we used to have weekly face-to-face training sessions in a classroom, discussing, collaborating, chatting. You used to bring coffee, and it was all what we were used to, right? So since yeah, it was different. And so since you've been engaging in the second module of this program, your engagement in the program, your support from the Institute has also changed. How did that impact? For example, going from face-to-face training sessions to live lectures. How did you feel as a student?
You know, I think that we missed, my cohort and I really missed the weekly chances to just catch up and debrief each other and share our sorrows and our happinesses. And I think that that was a sad loss for all of us. We really missed having those chances to just sit together and talk, you know, with WhatsApp groups and, you know, just frequent phone calls every now and then between some of us who are in similar boats or like same phases. We've been able to keep in touch. But I think that the loss of the cohort, not loss, but the reduced physical presence of the cohort has been a sad thing. But in terms of the actual learning, I mean, a lot of what we need to research and study is really our own personal journey into finding the research that we need to push ourselves forward, to understand how we're doing. I wouldn't say that academically we've missed out in that perspective, but probably, you know, being able to just physically just show a piece of work and say like, this is where I am, or just, you know, at the end of a session to have a chat with our teachers, that was definitely something missed.
Yeah, I agree. But in terms of the learning, and I know I've been present in many of your lectures, and the way that we did adapt, and the way that we as an institute, how we collaborated and managed those sessions, so that there was a member of staff delivering, there was someone managing the tech side, and then there was someone managing the chat. And that's actually now, as a team of teacher trainers, that is our new normal. That is the way that we behave and conduct ourselves throughout, you know. And I think as an institute as well, we will be reflecting and re-energizing, if you like, our delivery, our mode of delivery, and the type of support that we give to our future and current student teachers.
It's a really interesting parallel, that, isn't it? Because Asma, you're saying that actually you missed almost like the camaraderie of being in a group. And if you think about how do students feel like that, because they're well. So I think the whole sort of training process then maybe should be around modelling this sort of new process, new type of engagement, less around long talk, more around discussion, more around breakout spaces, in the same way that you would within a normal classroom, but use the tech to actually do it. And if that means that some things need to just be rebalanced to give you that sense of collegiality that you still want to have with your trainees, then maybe that's something to look at for the future as well.
Yeah. So we're going to be drawing the webinar to a close, and I'm going to ask Nick to conclude and close the webinar with your, I'd like your opinion and directive on what would your advice be to students who are currently in any teacher training program as they move into that sort of novice teaching phase of their journey, and those who would be interested in joining the teaching program over the next couple of years. But before we do that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you both for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've loved everything you've said, Asma. And as a cohort, the resilience that you've demonstrated, the support you've given to each other, your positivity, it has been overwhelming from the TELLAL point of view. And so a huge thank you to you and your cohort and any other student teachers that are currently enrolled in any program. We wish you the best of luck, and keep it positive and keep that digital learning going, Asma.
Definitely.
Absolutely, don't stop doing it. Yeah, move it forward.
Yeah.
So I think it's been a brilliant discussion, and thank you very much, Asma and Jyoti, for inviting me into this. I think just to go to your questions, new joiners, I don't think there's ever been a better time to actually be a teacher. And I know that's a twee thing to say, but actually it's one of the most rewarding jobs there is. And to be able to engage with young people in the way that we now can within this new mode of learning, you know, and breaking down barriers that have traditionally been, you know, four walls in a classroom, to know different ways of engaging, different use of digital technology and of social media to actually move learning forward. I think that's absolutely superb. And again, I go back to, there was a very interesting report written that actually said those who are coming into the profession really do think that technology is a genuine enabler and will be a transformer for the education system over the next 2 to 3 years. So, you know, I'd be strongly encouraging people to say, this is a fantastic profession to look at. It's also about, yes, learning your craft, but as you said very eloquently earlier on, Asma, it's about putting that into practice. Great learning the theory side, yeah, but how can you genuinely engage and interact? I think those who are currently training or are now into year 1 or year 2 of their teaching, I think this period has caused a lot of reflection, and quite rightly so. That again, you know, you went through a training program previously that was quite fixed around how do we organise a classroom, manage learning, manage physical bodies in front of us. Now we have to reflect. And as long as we're reflecting in the right way and can move this system forward, then I think we're in a very, very good place indeed. You know, there's lots of talk in education, and forgive me for saying this, but a lot of it is just rhetoric. People say, yes, we must change. Yes, we must have this. Bring on this, bring on that, bring on that. But no one ever puts it into practice. And I think now is our opportunity to genuinely change the world of education. I know it's a dreadful thing that we've had to have a pandemic to cause people to reflect in this way and maybe then act in this way. But that's the reality. You know, and we are the one industry, I think, that lags behind all others in terms of innovation and new approaches. So for me, in my role, I want to try and help and support all of our schools and teachers moving forward to actually look at what a brave new world could look like and should look like. And certainly with our own network of schools, we can begin that discussion. We know from the plans that are being put in place for next year, they're already looking very, very different from what you had before. Let's keep pushing, yeah, because I think they can go much further as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you both again for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Asma, wish you luck. Good luck in your first year as a qualified teacher. Well done.
Congratulations.
Thank you.